Pay Act, pick them up and pass them by unanimous consent so we don't have to worry about any of these issues not being addressed and important programs and projects not being funded. That's all it simply takes, Mr. President. I hope that can happen. And with that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
Mr. President.
The Senator from New Mexico.
Mr. President, we're here today with our government's doors shuttered because of a failure to understand basic civics. And frankly, this my way or the highway brinksmanship has been building for so long here in Washington, D.C., that I won't be surprised if the American people just say a pox on both your houses, Republicans and Democrats. But why are we in this fix, Mr. President? How did we get here? Sometimes when you're lost in the woods, it helps to retrace your footsteps so that you can find the way back out. We're here because some of our colleagues have forgotten their middle school civics lessons. They've forgotten that I'm Just a Bill episode of Schoolhouse Rock that some of the folks in the 70s and 80s remember, which reminds us all that to pass a bill or to repeal a bill, that you have to meet certain tests. You need a majority of the House of Representatives. You need a majority of the Senate, and if someone's going to filibuster, you need 60 votes. And you need the signature and the support of the President. We're here because my colleagues who want to repeal the Affordable Care Act don't have a majority of the Senate. They certainly don't control the White House, despite waging an entire election over the health care law. And since they can't repeal the health care law the way that we all learned about in middle school, they've decided to try something new. They've taken the government hostage. They've said, if you don't give me what I want, we're going to close down the federal government. Can you imagine, Mr. President, what it would look like if Democrats employed this kind of reckless and irresponsible tactic? What if we said, unless you raise the minimum wage to $15 an hour, we aren't going to pass a spending bill? Or remember in 2009 when our party tried to pass a cap-and-trade bill? We didn't have the votes to overcome a filibuster in the Senate, so I guess the lesson here is that we should have refused to fund the government until Republicans relented and passed a cap-and-trade bill. Can you imagine? That's not how our democracy works. It's not what our founders envisioned, and it's not compromise. Mr. President, it's extortion. It is our job to pass a spending bill every year. We can fight about how big that bill is. We can fight about how small that bill is going to be. But constitutional duty is not optional. Now, some are saying there needs to be further compromise in the spending bill. But it's clear that sometimes the Republican House doesn't know when to declare victory. They actually got the spending levels that they asked for. In the interest of keeping the government open, the Senate accepted House spending levels, sequester levels, in our funding resolution. I don't like those spending levels, Mr. President. Most Democrats don't support those spending levels. But we aren't willing to risk the entire economy or the well-being of our constituents just to get our way. The bottom line here is this. It's time to reopen the government. No strings attached, no policy riders, and no more hostage-taking. Just a clean funding bill that stops hurting our public servants, our communities, and our economy. A clean funding resolution that keeps the lights on while we negotiate, Mr. President, over a long-term budget. The Senate had the votes to pass such a bill, and we did. The House also has the votes to pass a clean funding bill. But Speaker Boehner won't bring it to the floor. He won't put it up for a vote because the most extreme members of his caucus want to play hostage politics instead. It's time to end this. It's time to drop the hostage politics and simply pass the one plan that has the votes to pass both chambers, a clean funding bill. So, Speaker Boehner, let them vote. Let your members vote their conscience on a clean funding resolution. It's your duty, Mr. Speaker. Just let them vote. That's all we ask. And, Mr. President, I would yield back my time.
President,
Senator from New York.
First I ask unanimous consent the period of morning business be extended until 4 p.m. and that all provisions of the previous order remain in effect.
Without objection.
And the senator, my good friend, the senator from Alabama, has graciously agreed to let us flip the order so that I'm going to go now and he does, but I would ask unanimous consent that that be done and that not change the alternating.
Without objection.
Thank you. And once again, I thank my colleague from Alabama. Mr. President, I rise to talk about an aspect of the Tea Party government shutdown that hasn't gotten the attention it deserves. Sadly, the effects of this Tea Party shutdown don't stop at our water's edge. The shutdown is putting our national security at risk. The senior senator from California, the chair of the Intelligence Committee, has talked to us about how 72% of our intelligence employees are not working. They are not all useless or laggards or slackers. In fact, there's a high degree of professionalism in the CIA, the NSA, and like agencies. And to have close to 3/4 of them not on the job puts every American at risk. Well, there's another area that's putting us at risk. We all know that the greatest threat to our national security and to that of Israel, or one of the greatest threats to our national security and the greatest threat to Israel's, is a nuclear Iran. In order to punish Iran for their pursuit of nuclear weapons, Republicans and Democrats, in a bipartisan way, led in many instances by two of my good friends here, the Democratic senior senator from New Jersey, Senator Menendez, the Republican senior senator from South Carolina, Senator Graham, they've come together to pass tough sanctions that would have a crippling effect on Iran's economy. And this body, in a bipartisan way, and the other body in a bipartisan way, have passed those. And just last week, we saw some of the first results of progress as President Rouhani said he was open to talks on the nuclear program. Iran had been intransigent before that. And one doesn't even know if they really want to give up nuclear weapons, whether this is a feint. But we certainly know that the sanctions is having a dramatic effect. What's changed Iran's mind? Have they suddenly had a change of heart out of the blue? No. The only thing that's changed their mind is the sanctions. And that's why they are at least acting differently than they have acted in the past. And who knows, hopefully they may actually do some real things if the sanctions continue. We know that these tough sanctions are a huge weight around the ankles of the Iranian economy. But right now, when Iran feels cornered for the first time, the shutdown of our government could well take that pressure off the Iranians, and it comes at exactly the wrong time. That's because the shutdown and its concomitant furloughs are preventing us from fully enforcing the sanctions, allowing companies that are trying to do business with Iran to escape punishment, allowing the Iranian economy to expand faster than it normally would have. There are many companies that try to evade these sanctions, but the federal government has cops on the beat that have been, by and large, overwhelmingly successful to make sure nobody can slip through the cracks and do business with Iran. But now, because of sanctions, because of the government shutdown and furloughs, those offices are greatly weakened. Two of the major offices in the Treasury Department that enforce sanctions, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis and the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, have only 30 of their 345 employees. Let me repeat that. Two of the most important offices that enforce sanctions have less than 10% of their employees. The 90% plus are on furlough. They can't work. The Office of Terrorist Financing and Intelligence, a vital cog in our enforcing tough sanctions against Iran, is usually staffed by 10 people. Right now, Mr. President, they just have one. 10%. And the Treasury Department's Office of Foreign Assets Control, the primary office responsible for enforcing these sanctions and punishing those who violate them, is also operating with a skeleton staff. And so, Mr. President, just at a time when we need the sanctions to continue to bite, this government shutdown is making it a lot easier for rogue actors to send oil and trade with the Iranian regime. We all know that those who try to avoid sanctions find the weakest place, and now, with so few of our people on the job because of the shutdown, it's going to be a lot easier for them. New sanction designations will halt. We won't be able to investigate sanction violations. We can't punish those who have violated the sanctions. The government's shutdown sends a dramatic and strong signal to those who seek to violate the sanctions and give the Iranian regime hope that they can continue to keep nuclear weapons. Couldn't come at a worse time. The Iranian sanctions have been our best pressure point, and the shutdown is letting the pressure off Iran at exactly the wrong time. Now, we've seen a pattern over the last few days, and I have a feeling I know what the response from the other side of the aisle, particularly the junior senator from Texas, will be. He'll say, okay, Democrats, that's a good point. Let's fund the sanctions, and maybe tomorrow or the next day we'll have a bill on the floor to restore those offices in the Treasury Department. And then maybe we'll point out that the government shutdown is hurting middle-class students getting college loans, something, again, that has had bipartisan support. And then maybe the junior senator from Texas or House Republicans will say, okay, let's fund that too. After a while, it gets a little ridiculous. The House Republicans and their seeming acquiescence to the junior senator from Texas have given the junior senator from Texas a veto power over which parts of the federal government are funded and which are not. At the request of the junior senator from Texas, who has fervently and passionately, we heard him a few minutes ago, said, don't fund the government unless Obamacare is eliminated, the House Republicans have shut down the government. And that's not a surprise, the junior senator from Texas's actions, because after all, he said 10 months ago, he said that he and the Tea Party, quote, have to be prepared to go as far as to shut the government down. It's not a surprise. Anyway, Republicans have shuttered the entire federal government, and they say they're willing to reopen it a piece at a time, provided that piece is blessed by the junior senator from Texas. To allow any one person to pick and choose which parts of the government can reopen is a cynical and ultimately extremely damaging way to run the government. It's dangerous for the country, and it's obvious that it won't succeed. One final point, Mr. President. It seems that today's talking point from my Republican colleagues is, let's talk. It's obvious they feel the pressure because America sees the intransigence of shutting down the government unless our colleagues in the House get 100% of what they want. But it's obvious when their talking point is let's talk, they've left out a key point at the beginning of their new talking point. Because to talk, only talk, while the government is shut down, does huge damage to millions of innocent people and to our country's economy. They forget to say, let's vote, then let's talk. So their motto should be modified. Ours is just vote. Just vote. Vote to let the government stay open. It'll take a single vote in the House of Representatives, and then let's talk. To say let's talk while the government is shut down prolongs the devastation to our colleagues. So I say to my Republican colleagues who have come up with this talking point, let's talk. You forgot the first part of your talking point. Just vote, then let's talk. I yield the floor and thank my colleague from Alabama for his courtesy.
The senator from Alabama.
Thank you, Mr. President. And I appreciate Senator Schumer's remarks about the Iran sanctions. They are very important. It's a action by the United States that I think has helped in a number of ways with the radicalism in Iran, and we need to keep it up. I did hear Mr. Clapper yesterday testify, I believe it was yesterday or the day before the Budget Judiciary Committee, and he said he had this number of people not working. Senator Grassley said, well, if they're not critical people, then why do you need so many? You've got a critical job. You need enough people to do the critical duties. How many do you need? You must not need all these people. You say they're not important to us. So Mr. Clapper, I don't think, had a very good answer to that. And when those raised the question of defense cuts and under the Budget Control Act and that sort of thing, he expressed concern about that, which I would share. I think Mr. Clapper is right to be concerned about it. So I asked him, Director Clapper, do you know the way to 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue? You ever heard of the Commander-in-Chief of the United States? And the House, the Republican House, I must say, has a half a dozen times or more over several years passed legislation that eases those cuts and finds other reductions in spending from other departments and agencies that receive no cuts and reduces the burden on the Defense Department. Indeed, the Defense Department represents 1/6 of the United States budget, and they're being asked to take 1/2 the cuts. And don't think that counts bringing down war costs in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's entirely different. This is the base defense budget that's taking half the cuts on the Budget Control Act. It's too much on the Defense Department. It ought to be spread around. The House has more than a half a dozen times voted to do that. It's died in the Senate because they want to, I guess, utilize the military to threaten Republicans. If you don't do what we want, we're not going to fund your military. And my goodness, the President is the Commander-in-Chief of the United States military. Doesn't he have a responsibility to make sure we're adequately funded? So I'm just getting a little frustrated with that argument, I gotta say. And first of all, I don't think he's required to lay off that many people. He indicated he was reviewing it. He's going to bring back more people, as he could have been doing all along. But it did allow another example of disastrous complaints beyond reality, I think. And one more thing. Senator Schumer and many of our Democratic colleagues have been conducting a sustained and direct attack on the millions of people who supported and identified with the Tea Party movement. Make no mistake about it. They don't believe, they don't respect the people in the Tea Party movement. They demean them in every way and virtually every day in this body, and everybody that's a part of that movement, because they believed in America. They thought this United States Congress had gone lunatic and spending their country into bankruptcy and passing Obamacare over overwhelming objection of the American people, and they did it anyway without listening. And they spontaneously rose up, and it clobbered a bunch of Democratic House members and senators, switched the whole majority in the House by a big number. So they don't like it. So everybody that opposes them, that says you're not listening to us, they're now demeaning and attacking. And I think the American people and the people that have identified and supported the Tea Party, either directly or indirectly, need to know that. I know the people in the Tea Party. They care about America, they love America, they can't understand what's going on here, and they think we're moving us into bankruptcy, and we forgot the entire concept of constitutional limited government. Well, Mr. President, we've heard a lot of talk about the challenges facing the government during the funding lapse we're in. All of us want to see the government return to normal operations, and I certainly do. But what we seem to be losing is the permanent consequences, the debt consequences of the Affordable Care Act. And it needs to be a part of this discussion. And the Democrats have refused to listen. They basically blocked any effort in the Senate to reform in any significant way the Affordable Care Act. And it's been going on ever since it passed. Their goal is to put up a wall around it. Anything that comes up, they won't listen to. They won't consider. They won't discuss. It's a fact. It's a deal. You can't even discuss it. The House has the right to fund what they want to fund under the Constitution and not fund what they choose not to. They're trying to initiate and force a discussion on one of the most important issues facing America. And one of the things that's so dangerous about this bill has not been properly discussed. And I want to talk about it today. So, you know, a lot of us are going to donate our pay during this furlough to charity, and I will, but I wish our friends would begin to be more concerned for the private sector workers, millions of American workers who will be permanently affected by the Affordable Care Act, hammered by it. Eventually, full funding will resume to our government. We know that. This furlough will end. But if this Obamacare remains in full effect, the consequences for American workers is going to be lasting, damaging. So will the consequences to the United States Treasury and our financial condition. In particular, as ranking member of the Budget Committee, I'd like to focus on the huge and fundamental accounting manipulation that lies at the center of this health care law. And I'm going to make some statements today, and I hope somebody, if they got the detailed objections to it or rejections of it, I want to see them, and I'll respond to them. But I'm correct in what I'm saying, and I look forward to any discussion anybody would like to have. But so far, people don't want to talk. They want to ignore. So we've got to deal with these accounting manipulations because it's a colossal blow to our Treasury. The Affordable Care Act was packaged and sold based on a promise that I am going to disprove. American people knew it wasn't true anyway. Before a joint session of Congress, before a joint session of the United States Congress, the President of the United States said and promised this, quote, "I will not sign a health care plan that adds one dime to our deficits now or any time in the future, period," close quote. That is a bold statement. As good as read my lips, I would say. As I addressed earlier this week, hundreds of billions of dollars in Medicare savings to their hospital insurance HI trust fund were double counted under the legislation that was passed, at least $400 billion over the 2010-2019 10-year period. $400 billion. So I asked for an analysis before the bill passed. December 23rd, we ended up voting on December 24th, Christmas Eve. They rammed it through before Scott Brown, who would have denied them the 60th vote, was elected in Massachusetts, liberal Massachusetts, on the commitment he would be the vote to kill Obamacare. But they're still able to get it through before he could take office. So the night before we voted, I asked CBO about it, and I insisted they give an answer, and they did. They said, quote, "The key point is that savings to the HI Trust Fund," that's Medicare, "under FPACA," that's Obamacare, "would be received by the government only once. So they cannot be set aside to pay for future Medicare spending and at the same time pay for current spending on the other parts of the legislation, Obamacare, or other programs. To describe the full amount of HI Trust Fund savings."
Your time has expired.
I would ask consent to have an additional 2 minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
CBO went on to conclude, to say, "To describe the full amount of HI Trust Fund savings as both improving the government's ability to pay Medicare future benefits and financing new spending outside of Medicare would essentially double count a large share of those savings and thus overstate the improvement in the government's fiscal position." What a statement that was. And in fact, CBO estimated that if Medicare savings were truly set aside to pay future Medicare benefits, the new health care law would not decrease but increase the deficit over the first 10 years and subsequent decade. In 2010, they say it would increase the deficit. But there's a lesser-known, equally shocking account gimmick that I want to mention today, and that is how it was done with Social Security. They've obtained another $100 billion over the next 10 years by double counting Social Security money. My time is up, and I could explain it in more detail, but we've got to understand this. According to the Government Accountability Office, and I asked them not too long ago when they issued a report, that over the next long-term implementation of this Obamacare, it would add $6.3 trillion to the debt of the United States. That's almost as much as the liabilities that Social Security have. And fully accounted for, my budget staff tells me that the Obamacare legislation will be harder to fund and add
Senator's time has
to the
expired.
deficit than will Social Security under current problems we're on. So we need to stop digging the hole, and we need to start fixing Medicare and Social Security, not adding another program we can't pay for. I thank the chair and will yield the floor.
Senator from Arizona.
Mr. President, I know this is not a town that's ever been known for having a long memory. In fact, the recent warning bells that have rung about our deficits and our debt have predictably faded into the background with all the attention on the rocky start to this fiscal year. Just last month, the Congressional Budget Office released its long-term budget outlook. Headlines and news stories associated with that release used words like grim and gloomy and raised alarms about, quote, long-term fiscal crisis. The very first line of that report reminds us that between 2009 and 2012, the U.S. government recorded the largest budget deficits when compared to the size of the economy in over half a century. Reflecting on the current state of play, CBO noted that the federal debt currently stands at roughly 3/4 of our gross domestic product. More alarmingly, they predict that our federal debt will match the size of our economy or be equal to 100% of GDP by the year 2038. I understand the temptation to just roll our eyes and politely suggest that these facts and figures are of more interest to green eyeshade bead counters, or to simply wave them off as last month's news. But frankly, this is made much easier when the administration says things like, quote, we don't have an urgent debt crisis. And when appropriation bills come to the floor at levels that make little sense given our current fiscal realities. Unfortunately, these facts and figures only tell part of the story. The CBO provides us insight into the impact these facts and figures will have on the economy and the federal budget deficit. If the growth of our federal debt is left unchecked, we could eventually see a further drop in private investment, an increase in interest payments, a decrease in Congress's flexibility, and, obviously, risk of fiscal crisis. CBO notes that, quote, the unsustainable nature of the federal government's current tax and spend policies presents lawmakers and the public with difficult choices to put the federal government on a sustainable path for the long run. Lawmakers will have to make significant changes to taxing and spending policies, end quote. We all know that given the current environment, it's difficult to do that. It's difficult when we have a problem just bringing routine spending measures to the President's desk. So this is not an easy conclusion to hear. But within our dim current fiscal landscape and even dimmer outlook, there has been at least one bright spot. In 2011, Congress agreed to and the President signed into law the Budget Control Act, or the BCA. This included statutory discretionary spending caps as well as automatic across-the-board spending cuts for a failure to enact additional deficit reduction measures. Certainly, trimming federal spending via across-the-board sequestration is an inelegant means, at best, of addressing our spending problem. It's often referred to as a blunt instrument. At a minimum, it is a lazy way to legislate. But I believe that I join a number of my colleagues when I say that I'm open to providing additional flexibility while staying within the budget caps with respect to the sequester. But you simply can't deny that locking in discretionary spending caps and enforcing them with automatic sequestration has yielded some of the most significant spending cuts that we've seen in Congress in years. As my colleague from Tennessee, who recently came to the floor, said, 2 years ago, discretionary spending stood at nearly $1.5 trillion. Last year, under the BCA spending caps, that number dropped to just under $1 trillion. And this year, if no changes occur to the sequester-enforced spending cap, we'll be at $976 billion. That's a significant drop. That is significant, and that is a good thing. A recent Wall Street Journal story entitled "The GOP's Unheralded Victory on Spending" quoted the head of Americans for Tax Reform as concluding that we had, quote, made a fundamental shift in the size of the government equation, end quote. While runaway spending on mandatory programs represents an ever-present issue that we have to get our arms around, the BCA caps and the sequester have put real and meaningful downward pressure on discretionary spending that represents about a third of our federal budget. My colleague from Kentucky, the minority leader, recently pointed out that the BCA that had passed 2 years ago, quote, actually reduced government spending for 2 years in a row for the first time since the Korean War, end quote. And I agree with him when he urges that we not walk away from the spending reductions that we have already promised taxpayers. Now, I've made no secret of the fact that I do not favor the strategy of tying the defunding of Obamacare to the current continuing resolution. As the resulting shutdown drags on, and there are more stories about the fights over funding next year, and then the coming debate over the debt ceiling, I find myself favoring this strategy even less. It's entirely likely that the sequester opponents will use the larger debate to push to undo the gains that we've made on meaningful spending cuts by abolishing the sequester and replacing it with meaningless savings, budget gimmicks, or even new taxes. Far from a conspiracy theory, in recent months there have already been calls for a 2-year sequester hiatus. I agree with Taxpayers for Common Sense when they say that, quote, this may be the convenient answer, but it is no way to get our fiscal house in order, end quote. Madam President, it's my hope that we can find a way through this shutdown sooner rather than later. It's also my hope that we can, at some point, have a real conversation about the long-term drivers of our crushing debt that underlie our need to regularly hike the debt ceiling. In the meantime, and as this debate unfolds, I urge my colleagues to resist any effort to undermine the Sequester Enforced Budget Control Act spending caps. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Madam President, House Speaker Boehner is sending to the Senate a series of bills to put one Band-Aid at a time on the House Republicans' government shutdown. It's an obvious attempt to fool the American people into thinking that House Republicans are acting to end the shutdown. But their transparent tactic is not fooling many people, and here's why. The people of this country know that the harm of a government shutdown isn't about the hands full of programs that House Republicans will dangle in front of us. The House Republican gambit will not put food inspectors back to work. It will not put Centers for Disease Control experts back to work tracking outbreaks of infectious diseases. It's not going to reopen Head Start classrooms for kids. Their piecemeal approach won't restart lending to small businesses or bring back the FAA inspectors who make sure commercial aircraft are safe, and it won't restore hundreds of other vital services and functions. Now, no matter how many rifle-shot bills the House Republicans try, all they do is leave our government full of holes. We could spend months legislating in bits and pieces while House Republicans ignore the obvious solution. The House should vote on the clean continuing resolution that the Senate has sent to them, because that vote will end the shutdown. Now, the Republican bits and pieces strategy is like smashing a piece of crockery with a hammer, gluing 2 or 3 bits back together today, a couple more tomorrow, and 2 or 3 more the day after that. House Republicans should stop before they do any more damage, put down the hammer, pick up the Senate's continuing resolution, and at least put it to a vote. I heard one Republican on the Senate floor yesterday argue that we should adopt the piecemeal approach because, after all, he said, under regular order, we pass separate appropriation bills for different parts of the government, one at a time. Now, while that's true, it's irrelevant. We have a mechanism for keeping the government open while we go through the regular order process. It's called a continuing resolution, and it keeps the full government open while we adopt appropriation bills one at a time. 5 days ago, the Senate passed for the 3rd time a continuing resolution to keep the government open and sent it to the House. It's well past time for Speaker Boehner to bring it to a vote. Republicans want to negotiate changes in the Affordable Care Act. Of course we'll talk about that once the government is functioning, but we should not and will not allow the United States government to be held hostage by the Republicans while we're talking about the Affordable Care Act or any other subject which they or we wish to talk about. Now, Madam President, I am keenly aware, as Chairman of the Armed Services Committee, that one of the most devastating effects of this Republican shutdown is its damage to our national security. Already, our men and women in uniform have been asked to operate under the damaging effects of sequestration. Those cuts have done serious harm to our military readiness and military families, and the shutdown is just making things far worse. Because of the House Republican shutdown, workers at Defense Department maintenance depots around the country who should be repairing and preparing vehicles, ships, and aircraft for combat are instead furloughed, along with hundreds of thousands of other Department of Defense civilians. Training exercises have largely come to a halt, and anyone who thinks that's no big deal has never spent any time with our men and women in uniform. The key factor in our military's effectiveness isn't our sophisticated weapon systems, as important as they are. It's the highly trained men and women who employ those weapons. Every day of this shutdown wears away the sharp edge of their readiness to respond to crises around the world. Now, some troops and their families won't get tuition assistance. Most travel is suspended, including many permanent changes of station. That means that military families scheduled to move to a new location who may have already sold a home at their old duty location or committed to a lease or a mortgage at their new location, and spouses who need to start a job search face financial loss and disruption and uncertainty in their lives. Our troops and their families can't even go to their on-post commissaries because they're closed. Now, the bill that we passed last week to ensure that our troops would receive paychecks were all well and good, but that did not address the many shortfalls that our troops and their families face during this shutdown. Another truly outrageous example is that the families of the brave men and women who are killed while defending this nation will see a delay in the payment of death benefits because of this shutdown. Now, some may say, you're right, these problems for our national security are intolerable. Let's pass a bill to fix them. We have. The Senate passed a continuing resolution 3 times the last 5 days ago that would keep the government functioning. Speaker Boehner refuses to allow the House to vote on the Senate-passed continuing resolutions. And no matter how many piecemeal bills that the Speaker sends to us here in the Senate, he'll be leaving out millions of Americans who will continue to suffer from the shutdown that he and Tea Party-dominated Republicans have created. Every day they spend obsessing over Medicare, over Obamacare, is one more day of unfairness and uncertainty for our troops and their families. Every day the House Republicans' destructive submission to the Tea Party is another day that food isn't inspected. It's another day that FBI agents are working without pay. It's another day that SBA isn't approving loans for small businesses. It's another day that scientists are barred from their labs, and on and on. Speaker Boehner can bring this chaos to a halt by bringing the Senate's continuing resolution to the floor of the House for a vote. The Senate has voted 3 times on House versions of continuing resolutions. Speaker Boehner refuses to vote even once on the Senate bill. Why? This is the question, by the way, the media has not yet asked Speaker Boehner. Why? Why has he not brought to the floor of the House the Senate-passed continuing resolution? And here's the answer. And it's a stunning answer, because it might pass. Now, you heard me right. The reason that Speaker Boehner is not bringing this continuing resolution passed in the Senate to the floor of the House for a vote is because it's going to pass. Now, that's anathema. It would be anathema to the Speaker of the House for a continuing resolution to pass if it depended upon Democratic votes. It is his policy not to depend on any Democratic votes to pass legislation in the House. The policy of the Speaker is truly the epitome of rank partisanship. In fact, I don't know of a clear example of extreme partisan policy than Speaker Boehner's refusal to hold a vote on bills that would rely on some Democratic votes to pass. Madam President, one of Speaker Boehner's Republican colleagues, Congressman Dent of Pennsylvania, has verified this sad fact. Here's what Congressman Dent said last night on PBS's NewsHour. Quote, and I would ask unanimous consent that I be allowed to proceed for 4 additional minutes.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, here's what Congressman Dent said. Quote, I do believe it's imperative that we do have a clean funding bill to fund the government. And then he continued, that was the intent of the Republican leadership all along. But obviously there were a few dozen folks in the House Republican Conference who weren't prepared to vote for a clean bill. And here's his conclusion. This is now a Republican congressman speaking last night, saying, a few dozen folks in the House Republican Conference weren't prepared to vote for a clean bill, and that's why we're in the situation we're in right now. Close quote. Madam President, that is an astonishing report of abdication of leadership in the House of Representatives. What an incredible statement about the stranglehold that a few dozen ideological zealots now have on the Republican Party in the House of Representatives. It is an extraordinary moment in history when a Speaker of the House allows a few dozen members of Congress to bring the government of this nation to a standstill. When you cut through all the claims and all the counterclaims, all the press conferences, all the photo ops, there is one unassailable, indisputable fact that remains. The Senate has passed a continuing resolution to keep the government open, and Speaker Boehner refuses to bring it to a vote in the House of Representatives. It need not be this way. All that is required to break the stranglehold that the Tea Party has on House Republicans is for Speaker Boehner to bring the Senate-passed continuing resolution that would reopen the government to the floor of the House for a vote. I urgently hope that he'll do so, and I hope that every hour until he does, he is asked to defend his refusal to do so. I yield the floor, Madam President.
Madam President?
Senator from Alabama.
I would ask consent that I be allowed to speak for 2 minutes and that be followed by Senator Enzi for the normal time he was allocated.
Is there objection? Without objection.
Madam President, we share being Attorney Generals of our states, and I just wanted to take a moment to express my sincere and deep thanks, and for all of us, to the men and women who protect us every day, the Capitol Police. We had a very serious incident yesterday. Our people rallied and responded in an appropriate way, I believe conducted themselves in a professional way. For example, I saw one young man, and he said that he'd heard and responded immediately, was running toward the scene. And we think, well, that's okay, that's what they do, you know, that's what they're supposed to do. But we need to understand that when one of our young men and women responding to a scene of a firing, a weapons discharge, they don't know what's there. And in this environment, it could be a very serious thing. And their very life is at stake every time. In every place they stand on our streets, every place they stand in our building here, the Capitol, our office buildings, they're standing there subject to a threat of somebody who could appear out of nowhere with deadly force. And they do it with professionalism and courage every day. And we've been very fortunate, I think, in seeing this Capitol be well protected. And I want to express my appreciation for them and all of them who place their lives at risk every day to protect the operational functions of this government. I thank the chair and would yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Wyoming.
I want to thank the Senator from Alabama for his comments, and I too want to add my thanks and appreciation for law enforcement people all over the United States who are doing their job and often have to do things like give tickets that they don't get anything but bad news and grief for, but they're out there protecting us at the same time, and they definitely deserve our admiration and our credit and our prayers. I also want to comment a little bit on what the Senator from Michigan said with his indisputable facts. The indisputable fact is that we're only where we are right now with the government shut down and the attempts to get a continuing resolution through because Congress didn't do its job, the Senate didn't do its job. The job that we have is to pass spending bills. If we had passed the spending bills, and there are 12 of them, if we had passed the 12 spending bills, there wouldn't be a need for a continuing resolution. What's a continuing resolution? It's permission for government to continue functioning like it's been functioning, spending 1/12 of what they spent the year before for each month until we finally come up with a spending bill. Well, the way the law is written, we're supposed to have a budget by April 15th, and that's a very significant day, and it's an intentional day. And then right after that, we're supposed to start doing spending bills. And we're supposed to allocate the amount of money that we want each agency, program, department to spend. And we haven't done that for years. And consequently, we get into this bind where we're saying, go ahead and spend money and we'll figure it out later. Well, we've had a sequester. And the way the sequester works is it's supposed to be a 2 3/10% reduction from each agency, program, department. And we did continuing resolutions last year. We did continuing resolutions, I think, for at least 7 months, probably 7.5 months, maybe 8 months. And so they got to continue spending what they'd been spending the year before. Now, they knew a sequester was coming because Congress, again, didn't do its work and come up with an alternate way to fund government. So they only had 4 months left to take their 2 3/10% out of their total spending, which would be the whole spending for the year. You know what that does? That makes it 5 3/10%. But that's not bad enough. We have an administration that sent out word to make it hurt. And we have an administration that also took care of Washington, but didn't take care of the people out in the hinterlands of Wyoming and the rest of the United States, the people that are out there actually doing the work, person to person, that is supposed to be done with what we are funding. Instead, it went to a lot of administration. I had some people in this week from the Head Start program, and they showed me how they were cut 7.5%. What part of 2 3/10% would 7.5% be? Well, part of it's at 5 3/10% because it came so late. But 7.5% because 2.5% of that goes to fund the federal government in Washington. That's not where the work's done. That's where the reports are done. That's where the regulations are done. That's where the things are done that stymie the people out there that are having to actually help the people. Civil Air Patrol came to me. They do search and rescue from the air when people are lost around Wyoming. They said, we're being cut 60%. I said, what part of 2 3/10% would 60% be? Well, they were even taking 3 of their 5 airplanes. I said, if they don't have any money, how can they take your airplanes? How would they have the money to fly them anywhere? Well, it's just one more of those things of the administration saying, make them feel the pain. And, of course, part of that was closing down White House tours. Now, how much can it cost for a self-guided White House tour? That's what they are. They're self-guided. You get a brochure. And it's my understanding that's about an $18,000 savings. That's nothing compared to what we're working with. We have $9 billion a year worth of duplication just in the things under health and education and labor and pensions. $9 billion in duplication. What's $18,000 do? Why shouldn't we take a look at those budgets in detail and get rid of duplication? This is duplication that is evaluated by the White House. But when we have a shutdown, we don't do that. We don't eliminate any of that. I mean, everybody's seen the World War II memorial with the barricades. Now, ever since the World War II memorial went up, I have never seen barricades there. I've been down there in the middle of the night and been able to walk through the World War II memorial or any of the other memorials down there. Now, I don't think I could use the restroom, and there's probably some justification for having the restrooms closed because there is a problem of cleaning them. It would require some additional personnel. But just to walk through things, we are making progress, though, because they also barricaded off Lincoln Park. It's a children's playground up here on the hill. And there were pictures in the paper the other day of a little girl looking at the sign on the gate that was locked saying that the park was closed. I'm pleased to report that yesterday that sign was gone, kids were playing in the park. There is no cost to that. So there's no purpose in having any kind of a shutdown regarding that. The Smithsonian out here is a national park. And there are streets that go through the national park. They go through it one way primarily, but they don't really have any additional cost to them. They don't serve anything. They don't, but they were blocked off. You couldn't go through streets that people normally drive through on any given day. In my own state, Jackson Hole, if you're driving from Du Bois to Jackson, on the right-hand side of the road is a gorgeous view of the Tetons. These are some land left over from the Alps that God had, and so he put them in Wyoming. And people like to stop and take pictures of them, particularly this time of year, because the aspens are turning to gold, and they're mixed in with the pine trees. And there's a river that runs through there, and then these majestic mountains. Well, the turnouts along that road are barricaded off. You can't turn out. You couldn't turn out to fix a flat tire. You couldn't turn out if you needed a nap. You can't turn out to take a picture. Why? And how did they get the barricades? How much did they have to spend for the barricades? How much did they have to spend to have somebody go out and put those barricades up? And incidentally, if you drive along the GW Parkway out here, it's the same way. The little turnouts that are along there are barricaded off. Where did we get all these barricades? If it was a business and they treated their customers that way, they'd be out of business, and they deserve to be out of business. And we should be operating differently than this. Now, I did notice that the Air Force are going to play Navy tomorrow. But the justification is that there's some revenue with that. And there really is. If you charge admission to those things and they're highly popular sporting events, there'll be a lot of people go and they'll pay a lot of money for it, and it will exceed the cost of putting on the venue. That would be the government making money. Boy, there's an oxymoron. But Yellowstone Park is in my state. And Yellowstone Park was the first national park. In fact, it was the first park in the world. And it's a huge park. In fact, it's the size of Connecticut, and it just fits up there in the corner of Wyoming. And a lot of people go through Yellowstone in order to get to Idaho or to get to Montana, or maybe Montana folks trying to get down to Wyoming. But that's all closed off now. And what's interesting to me is that if you do drive through there, you pay a fee. It's actually revenue. Now, of course, when I brought that up, I was reminded that the revenue goes to the general fund. But I had to say, do you know where the money for the national parks comes from? It comes from the general fund. So if you don't collect the money, you don't have the money to put back into the park. And not only that, there are concessionaires that pay to be able to sell gas and food and lodging in Yellowstone Park. And their customers can't get to them. I don't think we relieved them of paying the fee that they have to pay. And I'm pretty sure that the concessionaires were expecting about $4.5 million worth of business this month. Not the busiest month in Yellowstone, but an important month. I think there are ways that we could have continued to collect revenue, but we're not doing that. Let's make it hurt. So we're here with this continuing resolution. And the last vote that I got to do was actually a vote to have a conference committee. It wasn't any demands from the House. It was a request for a conference committee. What happens to the conference committee? The leader appoints some people from here and in conjunction with the minority leader, and they appoint some in the House, and they get together and they try and work this out. But no, that was voted down by the Democrats, so we're not going to have that.
Senators.
I'd have a lot more that I'd say on this, but I realize that my time has expired. We're in this position because we've been doing a bad job of governing. I yield the floor.
Madam President.
Senator from Michigan.
Thank you very much, Madam President. We are, in fact, in day 4 of a Tea Party Republican shutdown. And we need to be very clear at how we got here. The Senate Majority Leader negotiated with the Speaker of the House, and after a long negotiation where the Senate made major concessions, we agreed to pass a 6-week funding bill for services of the United States government to keep services open while we negotiate the larger issues around the budget. We passed the bill with the funding levels asked for by the House Republicans. So the Republicans asked that we continue funding below the levels we believe are necessary to grow the economy for 6 weeks, rather than having a government shutdown. At the time, we believed it was in the interests of the American people, of all those who provide those important services to us, that we, in fact, agree with the House on a 6-week extension, and we sent it over to them. Asked for by the Speaker, agreed to by the Senate. And there it has sat. Let me quote again from Congressman Dent, who said last night on the PBS NewsHour, a Republican colleague of Senator Boehner's, or Speaker Boehner's, I do believe it's imperative that we do have a clean funding bill, a straight funding bill, to fund the government. That was the intent of the Republican leadership all along, but obviously there were a few dozen folks in the House Republican Conference who weren't prepared to vote for a clean bill, and that's why we're in the situation we're in. A few dozen folks. A few dozen folks, part of the Tea Party wing, he says that's why they are where we are today. Now, you can overcome that. It's very simple, and that is just bring the bill that the Speaker said he wanted, that we were willing to agree to for a short-term funding of federal services, bring it to the floor, and those few dozen folks can vote no, and everybody else could vote yes. And then we would have the government back open. So it is truly a question of just letting the House vote. Just vote. Right now, today, before 5 o'clock, we could be done with this irresponsible action. We could then make sure the federal government can pay its bills and not default, and at the same time go to conference to negotiate the larger budget issues which we need to do. But that's not what's happening. So it's now day 4. Government services still closed. The bills that could open it up, that has a majority vote, that has Republicans and Democrats sitting in the House, because admittedly, Republican members of the House saying a few dozen folks didn't like it. Well, in our great democracy, our founders said majority rule, but somehow we seem to have forgotten around here. We have elections, the person who gets the majority wins, the others aren't happy, they lose, majority rule. Same thing happens on legislation. And so now we're in a situation with a group defined as a few dozen folks in the House driving the train because there is no leadership in the House to bring the vote up and be able to pass this with a bipartisan vote. We are paying a very big cost right now as a country for waiting for the House to vote. Nearly 800,000 people have been laid off. 800,000 people. We're just barely coming out of the recession. We're coming back. We're creating jobs. Not enough. When this president came in, we had 6 people looking for work for 1 job. Now it's down to 3 people looking for work for 1 job. Better. Not good enough. More to do. We all know it. So what is the response? Well, let's just lay off 800,000 people in the middle of this effort to try to bring back a middle class roaring back in this country. This is about 7,500 people in my home state of Michigan, people providing important services, people who are in middle class jobs, have a mortgage, have at least 1 car payment, many sending the kids to college, trying to make sure that they can care for their family, proud of what they do, providing various public services that we all benefit from, who are now sitting and waiting. It's costing our country about $300 million a day. $300 million a day in lost wages and productivity. $300 million a day that we cannot afford to lose. And this could all be ended in 5 minutes if the Speaker of the House would just allow a vote on a bill that contains the funding levels that the Speaker himself asked for. Not those that we would like to see, because on a longer-term negotiation, we're going to fight very, very hard to increase opportunities through an education innovation, focusing more on economic growth and jobs. This is a number asked for a short-term continuing resolution for 6 weeks. They evidently cannot take yes for an answer. Madam President, today I got an opportunity to meet a wonderful little boy named Kai, 2 years old. He and his mom, Anna, were with us talking about the impact on the National Institute of Health, the Center for Disease Control, the Food and Drug Administration, other public health functions for our country and what it means to families. Kai was born with a heart defect. He's had 2 bypass surgeries now in just his 2 little years of life. And thanks to a clinical trial at the Children's National Health System, Kai was able to get innovative treatment that he needs, and he was running all over the place this morning. A great success story. You know, it's the things that we do together as a country that we should be proud of. The work that's being done by our doctors and researchers at places like the National Institutes of Health, the Center for Disease Control and Prevention, the Food and Drug Administration, are literally saving lives. These men and women who are now furloughed, not working because of the shutdown, have gone through years of training. They're dedicated. They love what they do. These are some of the top experts on infectious diseases and food safety and cancer research in the country and in the world. And right now they're sitting at home, maybe watching us, trying to figure out what the heck is going on, or stronger language. They're not allowed to work. If they are working, they're not working with pay, all because of a few dozen folks in the House of Representatives. The Tea Party folks who are running the show in the House, who have decided they want to shut the entire government down over the Affordable Care Act, over the fact that we believe, the country believes, there ought to be a way to find affordable insurance for up to 30 million folks that haven't been able to find and purchase affordable insurance. The director of the division at the CDC that monitors foodborne illnesses, scary stuff like E. coli outbreaks, said recently he has 3 people working in his whole department right now. 3 people for our country monitoring foodborne illnesses. 3 people in charge of tracking every possible case of foodborne illnesses in the entire country. This needs to be a wake-up call, Madam President. It's time to get the government open so that people can go back to work who are in positions to monitor and protect our public health, the defense of this country, educational opportunities, safety of our country. Get these CDC officials back to work and make sure our families are safe. CBS News reports that the Center for Disease Control's headquarters, which is in Atlanta, Georgia, is a ghost town. Folks that monitor infectious diseases have 6,000 employees in Atlanta, Georgia, and they are calling it a ghost town. In America, the greatest country in the world. The director of the CDC, the nation's top doctor in charge of infectious diseases, says he is, quote, losing sleep because, quote, I don't know that we will be able to find and stop the things that might kill people. I don't know that we will be able to find and stop the things that might kill people. Might ask for an additional minute.
Is there objection?